In a condemned apartment building's basement, where shadows dance with despair, 10-year-old Tommy crafts a world from discarded treasures and fading memories of his mother. His fingers dance across a makeshift keyboard drawn on cardboard, playing silent melodies that echo only in his mind. When billionaire Charles Easton purchases the building, he expects to find broken pipes and crumbling walls. Instead, he discovers a child whose haunting eyes mirror a ghost from his past. One decision will unravel decades of buried secrets, challenge a powerful family's legacy, and ignite a media firestorm that threatens to consume them all. But nothing is quite what it seems. In the shadows of Marshall Heights' condemned apartment building, 10-year-old Tommy Parker created a universe within 4 damp walls. The basement, with its perpetual chill and musty air, had been his home since his mother Clara's passing 3 years ago. The space, barely large enough for a grown person to stand upright, became a canvas for his imagination and a shelter from the world that had forgotten him. Every morning, Tommy would wake before sunrise, careful to avoid the early maintenance workers. His bed was a collection of discarded cushions and a worn blanket he'd found in an abandoned apartment upstairs. On the wall, illuminated by a single flickering bulb, hung drawings of a woman with kind eyes and flowing hair, his mother, rendered in crayon and memory. The basement held his treasures, a collection of objects others had thrown away, but which Tommy had transformed into his family. A cracked mirror became his window to the outside world. A cardboard box, flattened and marked with hand-drawn piano keys, served as his instrument. His fingers would dance across the silent keys, playing melodies he remembered his mother teaching him during better days. Survival required cunning. Tommy had learned to time his ventures outside perfectly after the school buses left but before the neighborhood kids returned. He'd search through dumpsters behind restaurants, knowing which ones threw away unopened packages and where the kindly baker sometimes left day-old bread. The local grocery store's back alley became his pantry, though he never took more than he needed for the day. The neighborhood kids who occasionally discovered him called him Basement Boy and made up cruel stories about why he lived there. Some would throw rocks at him when he ventured out, forcing Tommy to develop an intricate network of hiding spots and escape routes throughout the abandoned building. The worst was Jimmy Connor, whose father owned the convenience store nearby. Jimmy took particular pleasure in hunting Tommy down, as if it were some twisted game. During rainy days, water would seep through the ceiling, creating a symphony of drips that Tommy would conduct with a broken stick. He'd position buckets and containers strategically, turning necessity into music. Each container produced a different note, and in the darkness he could almost pretend he was performing in one of those grand concert halls his mother used to describe. In one corner lay his most precious possession, a water-damaged photo of his mother sitting at a piano, her face radiant with joy. Tommy would talk to the photo every night, telling her about his day, his discoveries, and his dreams. He'd memorized every detail of her face, afraid that one day even these memories might fade like the photograph itself. The building's other residents, mostly elderly or troubled souls who couldn't afford better housing, barely noticed the small shadow that flitted through their halls. Those who did see him chose to look away, their own struggles too overwhelming to allow room for concern about a strange, quiet boy. Tommy preferred it this way. Invisibility meant safety, meant no one would send him away from the last place he felt connected to his mother. When the weather turned cold, Tommy would climb through the building's ancient heating ducts to stay warm, learning every creak and groan of the decaying structure. He'd found a way to access the public library's Wi-Fi from a particular corner of the basement, where he'd spend hours reading on an old smartphone he'd repaired from parts found in the trash. Through this digital window, he taught himself what he could, clinging to his mother's words about the importance of education. Some nights, when the loneliness became too heavy, Tommy would play his cardboard piano and sing softly to himself, songs his mother had taught him. The music existed only in his head, but it was enough to keep her memory alive, to remind himself that he was more than just a shadow in a basement. He was Clara Parker's son, and somewhere in his heart he believed that meant something important. Charles Easton stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, surveying the Manhattan skyline he'd helped reshape. At 52, he'd built Easton Developments into a real estate empire worth billions, yet success had brought him no peace. His reflection in the glass showed a man worn not by age but by regret, steel grey hair framing a face that rarely smiled, deep-set blue eyes that carried shadows of the past. The Wall Street Journal on his desk proclaimed another successful quarter, but Charles barely glanced at it. Instead, his attention fixed on an old photograph hidden in his desk's bottom drawer, a young woman with auburn hair standing beside a piano, her smile radiant and full of promise. Clara Thompson. 25 years had passed, yet the weight of his failure to protect her still pressed upon his conscience like a stone. His mother, Eleanor Easton, remained a formidable presence in both his business and personal life. At 78, she still commanded the Easton Foundation with an iron grip, her philanthropy as calculated as her cruelty. Every charity gala, every press announcement served to maintain the family's carefully crafted image. But Charles knew the dark truths behind their legacy, truths that haunted his dreams and poisoned his achievements. The Anderson Heights development project before him should have been routine: buy, demolish, rebuild. Yet something about this particular property stirred uncomfortable memories. Perhaps it was the building's age, similar to the old Easton mansion where Clara had once filled the halls with music. Or perhaps it was simply time catching up with him, forcing him to confront the ghosts he'd spent decades avoiding. His marriage had failed years ago, his ex-wife tired of competing with the shadows that followed him. The tabloids had a field day with the divorce, but it was merely another scar on a heart already riddled with them. He'd never told anyone about Clara, about the real reason behind his sleepless nights and his obsessive work habits. Eleanor's weekly visits to his office were exercises in tension. Today was no different as she swept in, elegant as ever in Chanel, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. "Charles, darling," she began, her voice honey-coated steel, "the board is concerned about your recent humanitarian interests. We're developers, not social workers." The words echoed their conversation from 25 years ago when he discovered Clara's pregnancy. His mother's solution then had been swift and brutal: a forced marriage to one of their business associates, a hefty payment to keep quiet, and Clara's subsequent disappearance. Charles had been too young, too weak to stop it. His empire had been built on precision and control, every detail meticulously planned. Yet lately, the cracks in his carefully constructed world had begun to show. The nightmares had returned: Clara's tears, her music silenced, his own cowardice. Each new development project felt like another attempt to bury the past under concrete and steel. The charity wing of Easton Developments, his one act of rebellion against his mother's influence, focused on arts education for underprivileged youth. Eleanor called it a waste of resources, but Charles saw it as inadequate penance. Every time he funded a music scholarship, he imagined Clara's approval, though he knew he'd lost the right to seek it long ago. In his private moments, Charles would sometimes sit at the grand piano in his penthouse, a magnificent instrument that gathered dust. He never learned to play, but he kept it tuned, as if waiting for the music to return. His staff whispered about his peculiarities, about the melancholy that seemed to follow him like a shadow, but none knew the true depth of his regret. As night fell over the city, Charles remained in his office, reviewing the Anderson Heights proposals. Tomorrow he would visit the site, another routine inspection of another routine project. Yet something about this one felt different, as if the fates were finally aligning to force his confrontation with the past. He couldn't know that through this project, life was about to offer him what he'd never dared hope for: a chance at redemption. Clara Thompson had arrived at the Easton Mansion in the spring of 1998, a scholarship student from Juilliard forced to abandon her dreams to support her ailing father. Her first day, she'd caught young Charles's attention not with her beauty, but with the way her fingers unconsciously tapped piano rhythms on the kitchen counter as she worked. Eleanor Easton had hired her as a housekeeper, but Clara's music refused to be silenced. During her early mornings cleaning the mansion's grand rooms, Clara would pause at the Steinway in the music room, allowing herself just moments to play. The notes would float through the halls like ghosts of what could have been. Sometimes Charles would secretly watch from the doorway, mesmerized by the transformation that overtook her when she played the housekeeper's uniform couldn't mask the artist within. Her talent hadn't gone unnoticed. Several of the Eastons' wealthy friends had commented on the beautiful music during morning visits. Eleanor's response was always the same, a tight smile and a swift change of subject. But Clara had already begun teaching piano to the staff's children in her spare time, her small wage supplemented by their parents' grateful offerings. The romance between Clara and Charles bloomed quietly, hidden in sheet music and whispered conversations about Chopin and Beethoven. He was 19, she was 23, and both were naive enough to believe love could bridge the chasm between their worlds. But Eleanor Easton had other plans, ones that would ensure the Easton name remained untarnished by scandal. When Clara discovered she was pregnant, she'd first told Charles, her hands trembling as she held the test. His promise to stand by her had been genuine, but ultimately powerless against his mother's machinations. Eleanor had summoned Gregory Mitchell, a business associate 40 years Clara's senior, and arranged everything with the efficiency of a corporate merger. The marriage certificate was signed within a week, Clara's tears hidden behind a borrowed veil. The last time Charles saw her at the mansion, she'd been packing her small bag, her hands no longer tapping rhythms, her music silenced. He'd watched from his window as she climbed into Mitchell's car, his mother's satisfied smile reflected in the rearview mirror. What Eleanor hadn't known was that Clara had continued teaching music, even after Mitchell had abandoned her and their unborn child. She'd found work at a community center in the Bronx, transforming lives one piano lesson at a time. Her students were children who couldn't afford proper lessons, but in them, she nurtured the dreams she'd been forced to abandon. The pregnancy had been difficult, but Tommy's first cry had been perfectly pitched G-sharp. Clara would joke in her diary. She'd worked multiple jobs, saving every spare dollar for a piano they could never afford. Instead, she'd drawn keyboards on paper, teaching Tommy finger positions and music theory before he could read words. In her final years, as illness took hold, Clara had tried repeatedly to contact Charles. Her letters, never delivered thanks to Eleanor's vigilance, spoke of forgiveness and hope. She wrote of Tommy's natural talent, how music flowed through him just as it had through her. The last letter, written from her hospital bed, contained only a simple request: let him play. The community center where she taught held a memorial service, attended by dozens of her students but none of the Eastons. They played Mozart's Requiem on an out-of-tune upright piano, while 7-year-old Tommy sat silent, his fingers moving to music only he could hear. Within months, he disappeared into the basement of the condemned building, carrying only his mother's photograph and her dreams. Clara's legacy lived on in the muscle memory of her students' fingers, in the way Tommy could close his eyes and see musical notes dancing in the air. She'd left him more than just survival skills, she'd given him her resilience, her passion for music, and an unwavering belief that beauty could grow in the darkest places. The last entry in her diary, found among Tommy's treasures in the basement, read, "My dearest Tommy, music will always find its way home. Listen for it in the silence, in the spaces between heartbeats. That's where love lives forever. Your mother, who plays now only for you." The February morning Charles Easton visited Anderson Heights was bitter cold, his expensive leather shoes crunching on frozen puddles as he entered the condemned building. His development team followed nervously, briefcases clutched tight, their breath visible in the dim hallway. The initial inspection was supposed to be routine structural assessment, asbestos check, evacuation timeline. Nobody expected to find life in this concrete tomb. The basement inspection wasn't even on the schedule until Charles heard it, faint but unmistakable. Someone was humming Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece Clara used to play in the mansion's music room. He dismissed his team, drawn to the sound like a man in a trance, following the melody down crumbling stairs into darkness. The humming stopped abruptly when his flashlight beam cut through the gloom. In the corner, a small figure froze, hands poised over a cardboard keyboard. Charles's light revealed walls covered in crayon drawings, makeshift furniture crafted from discarded items, and a child whose eyes held both fear and defiance. But it was the photograph propped against a tin can that stopped Charles's heart. Clara, seated at the mansion's Steinway, her smile eternally frozen in time. "Who are you?" Charles's voice cracked, though he already suspected the answer. The boy remained silent, backing away like a cornered animal. Charles noticed how the child's fingers never left the cardboard keys, maintaining their position even in retreat. A musician's instinct, Clara's gift. The silence broke when footsteps thundered overhead, the development team searching for their boss. Tommy's escape was instantaneous, a practiced maneuver through a small utility tunnel, but in his haste he left behind his mother's photograph. Charles held it with trembling hands, recognition and guilt crashing over him like waves. That afternoon, Charles cancelled all meetings and sat in his parked car outside the building. He watched as Tommy emerged at dusk, scavenging through nearby dumpsters with practiced efficiency. The boy's movements were precise, cautious as shadow dancing between streetlights. Charles observed his careful selection of salvageable food, noted how he shared his findings with a stray cat before disappearing back into the building. Unable to stay away, Charles returned at midnight. He found Tommy back at his cardboard piano, trying to recreate his mother's music from memory. The scene was heartbreaking, a child crafting beauty from abandonment, turning desperation into art. When Tommy finally acknowledged his presence, the words were barely a whisper, "You knew my mother." Not a question, but a statement. Charles sat on an overturned bucket, maintaining a careful distance. "Clara Thompson," he said softly. "She was the finest pianist I've ever known." Tommy's fingers stilled on the cardboard, his eyes searching Charles's face for truth. The conversation that followed was delicate, fragmented. Tommy spoke of Clara's final years, of music lessons in cramped apartments, of hospital rooms where she'd draw piano keys on paper sheets. Charles listened, each word a dagger of regret, learning how Clara had survived, created, taught, and loved despite everything his family had stolen from her. As dawn approached, Charles made a decision that would change both their lives. Not from pity, not from guilt, but from recognition of Clara's spirit living on in her son's unwavering devotion to music. He offered Tommy a choice: continue in the basement, or come with him and honor Clara's legacy properly. Tommy's response was to place his hands on the cardboard keys and play silently, but with such precision that Charles could hear the melody in his head. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Clara's favorite piece, performed on makeshift keys in a basement that had become both prison and sanctuary. As Charles watched the boy play his silent symphony, he realized that saving Tommy wasn't about redemption. It was about music finding its way home, about fulfilling a promise he'd made to Clara 25 years ago, a promise to protect what was precious, to stand against his mother's coldness, to choose love over legacy. The moment was interrupted by his phone buzzing Eleanor, demanding an update on the inspection. Charles silenced it without answering. For the first time in decades, he knew exactly what Clara would want him to do. The choice was finally clear, though the path ahead was anything but. The headlines exploded within hours of Charles Easton filing for emergency guardianship of Tommy Parker. "Billionaire developer saves basement boy," screamed the New York Post, while more serious publications probed deeper. Easton heir's surprising move raises questions about Anderson Heights development. In his penthouse office, Charles faced the first wave of opposition from his own legal team. "Mr. Easton, this is unprecedented," his head counsel warned, spreading documents across the mahogany desk. "The media will dig. They'll question everything. Your mother is already demanding an emergency board meeting, but Charles's attention remained fixed on Tommy, who sat in the adjacent room, fingers tracing patterns on the window glass. The decision had come at dawn after that night in the basement. Charles had made one phone call, not to his mother, not to his lawyers, but to Sarah Mitchell, a trusted social worker he'd worked with through his foundation. "I need to do this right," he'd told her. "This boy deserves more than good intentions." Eleanor Easton's arrival at the office was like a winter storm, sudden, cold and destructive. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed, perfectly manicured nails digging into the leather chair. "First the music scholarships, now this? Do you want to destroy everything we've built?" But when she saw Tommy through the glass partition, her face went ash white. The boy was Clara's mirror image. The board meeting that followed was brutal. Every aspect of Charles's life was questioned, his motives dissected. "This will impact our investors," one board member argued. "The timing with the Anderson Heights project." Another added, "There are proper channels for handling abandoned children." Charles listened, his response simple, "I'm not asking for permission." The media circus intensified when someone leaked Clara's old employment records from the mansion. Speculation ran wild about Charles's connection to the boy's mother. Social media exploded with theories, from the charitable to the scandalous. Through it all, Charles remained focused on Tommy's immediate needs: medical care, psychological support, education assessment. Sarah Mitchell proved invaluable, guiding them through the legal labyrinth while keeping Tommy's well-being paramount. "He's severely undernourished," she reported, "but remarkably well-educated, considering." Clara did an amazing job under impossible circumstances. The mention of Clara's name still made Charles flinch, but he forced himself to listen, to understand the life his cowardice had helped create. The first night Tommy spent in the penthouse revealed the depth of his trauma. Charles found him sleeping in the walk-in closet, his few possessions arranged precisely as they had been in the basement. The cardboard piano lay at his feet, a shield against this strange new world. That night Charles made another decision he called Manhattan's finest piano dealer. Eleanor's attempts to derail the guardianship were relentless. Anonymous tips to child services, whispered concerns about Charles's mental state, subtle threats to board members' investments, but she hadn't counted on the public's reaction to Tommy's story. In a city numbed by wealth and power, the image of a child surviving through music touched something profound. The piano arrived on a Thursday at Steinway Grand, identical to the one Clara had played in the mansion. Tommy approached it like a wild animal might approach a strange creature, circling, watchful. When finally his fingers touched the keys, the note that rang out a perfect G-sharp brought tears to Charles's eyes. Clara's son had found his voice. Legal proceedings moved forward despite Eleanor's interference. Charles's legal team, initially skeptical, became fierce advocates after meeting Tommy. His quiet dignity, his obvious musical gift, and the way he carried his mother's memory transformed corporate lawyers into protective champions. The development team pressured Charles about Anderson Heights. Deadlines were looming, investors growing nervous. His response was to purchase the building outright, personally. "The demolition is postponed indefinitely," he announced. Sometimes preservation matters more than progress. As media interest intensified, Charles made a critical choice: transparency over secrecy. He hired Catherine Reynolds, a respected journalist known for her integrity, to tell Tommy's story. No speculation, no sensationalism, he insisted. But just the truth about a boy who never stopped hearing the music. The article was being prepared when Eleanor made her final play a press conference, announcing her concerns about her son's stability. But as she stood at the podium, prepared to destroy Charles's reputation to maintain control, a sound drifted through the hotel's grand hallway. Tommy was playing Clara's favorite Chopin piece in the adjacent ballroom, each note a testimony to survival and hope. The press conference never happened. Eleanor left through a side door, her power finally broken by a melody she'd tried to silence 25 years ago. Charles found Tommy still at the piano, lost in the music, Clara's photograph propped on the music stand. In that moment, he understood this wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about giving music back its voice. Tommy's first steps into the eastern penthouse were hesitant, his worn sneakers barely making contact with the marble floors. The space dwarfed him, floor-to-ceiling windows, modern art installations, and furniture that had never known the touch of salvaged treasures. He carried his cardboard piano like a shield, refusing to let the cleaning staff take it away. The transition began with small victories and haunting setbacks. Sarah Mitchell, the social worker, noted how Tommy would hoard food in his room, tucking granola bars and apples into drawer corners. At dinner, he'd eat with mechanical precision, as if each meal might be his last. Charles recognized the behavior survival instincts don't fade overnight. School proved another challenge. Despite Clara's efforts to educate him, Tommy's formal schooling had gaps. The prestigious Winchester Academy, selected for its arts program, agreed to accept him mid-semester, but the social dynamics were overwhelming. Children whispered about the basement boy, their curiosity a different kind of cruelty than he'd known on the streets. Music became his bridge between worlds. Miss Anderson, the school's piano teacher, wept after his first lesson. He plays from somewhere deeper than training, she told Charles. It's as if the music lives in his bones. Tommy spent hours at the Steinway, sometimes just sitting, his fingers hovering over keys that had replaced cardboard. Nightmares plagued him. Charles would find him in the early hours, curled in corners or under furniture, searching for the familiar confines of his basement sanctuary. Dr. Rachel Foster, a child psychologist specializing in trauma, helped them understand. He's not just adjusting to a new home, she explained. He's learning to exist in a world that previously rejected him. The media attention complicated everything. Photographers camped outside Winchester Academy, forcing the school to hire additional security. Tommy's classmates' parents demanded interviews, eager to align themselves with the Eastern narrative. Charles fielded it all with a fierce protectiveness, but couldn't shield Tommy from every intrusion. Small breakthroughs came unexpectedly. One morning, Charles found Tommy teaching the housekeeper's daughter piano basics, using the same techniques Clara had used with him. Another day, he discovered Tommy had organized his massive walk-in closet to mirror his basement layout, but with the crucial difference: the door remained open. The first public piano recital was both triumph and torment. Tommy chose Chopin's Nocturne, his mother's favorite piece. The audience fell silent as this small boy in a new suit approached the grand piano. When he played, it wasn't just music, it was Clara's story, told through her son's fingers. The standing ovation terrified him. He ran backstage and hid for hours. Eleanor's attempts to connect with her newfound grandson were met with silent resistance. Tommy would retreat into himself during her visits, his fingers tapping silent rhythms on his leg, a self-soothing technique Charles recognized from Clara. After the third uncomfortable encounter, Eleanor stopped trying, but her calculating gaze followed Tommy's every public appearance. The breakthrough came during a thunderstorm 6 weeks after Tommy's arrival. The power failed, plunging the penthouse into darkness. Charles found Tommy not hiding, but at the piano, playing through the blackout. "Mum always said music lights up the dark," he said quietly, making room on the bench for Charles. It was the first time he'd spoken about Clara without being asked. As spring approached, Tommy began to transform his new bedroom. The cardboard piano remained, but joined by real sheet music and music theory books. He pinned his mother's photograph above the real piano, adding his own drawings around it, no longer just memories, but dreams too. Sketch of Carnegie Hall, musical notes spiraling into the sky. Clara's smile watching over it all. Winchester Academy noted improvements academically and socially. A few classmates, drawn by his music rather than his story, became tentative friends. Tommy started participating in group activities, though he still preferred the piano room during lunch breaks. His music teacher proposed entering him in a junior pianist competition, a suggestion that caused equal parts excitement and terror. Charles watched the transformation with a mix of joy and guilt. Each of Tommy's achievements highlighted what Clara had lost, what she'd been denied. Yet in her son's growing confidence, her spirit soared. Tommy's trauma would never fully heal. Some basements live in the heart, but he was learning to play a new song, one note at a time. One evening, Charles overheard Tommy on the phone with Sarah Mitchell, his voice quiet but clear. "I still miss the basement sometimes. Is that wrong?" Her response, gentle and wise, carried through the hallway home lives in many places, Tommy. Sometimes in basements, sometimes in penthouses, but always in the music. That night, Tommy played until midnight, his music floating over the city lights. The cardboard piano sat in the corner, no longer a necessity but a testament to survival. Clara's son was finally stepping into the light she'd always dreamed for him, carrying her melody forward into a future she'd died protecting. The spring air carried music through the penthouse's open windows as Tommy practiced his scales, each note more confident than the last. Charles sat in his home office, door open, letting the melody wash over him while reviewing development proposals. These moments had become their routine, separate, but connected through Clara's legacy. Their relationship evolved through music first. Charles would sit quietly during Tommy's practice sessions, learning to read the boy's moods through his playing. Chopin for contemplation, Mozart for joy, Bach for the difficult days when memories weighed heavily. The Steinway became their common ground, a bridge between past and present. Tommy's natural talent flourished under proper instruction. Miss Anderson arranged private lessons with renowned pianists, each one marveling at his intuitive understanding of music. He doesn't just play the notes one instructor observed, he speaks through them. Charles recognized Clara's gift, the ability to transform emotion into melody. Their first real conversation about Clara happened during a thunderstorm. Tommy was playing through his fear of the lightning when Charles shared stories of his mother's early mornings at the mansion's piano. She would play before sunrise, he said. When she thought no one was listening, Tommy's fingers stilled on the keys. She did that at home too, he whispered, and the wall between them cracked. Weekends became their time for exploration. They visited music stores, where Tommy taught Charles about different pianos' personalities. "This one's shy," he'd say, "touching a baby grand, but it has stories to tell." They attended concerts, Tommy analyzing performances with growing sophistication, while Charles learned to hear music through his ears. The boy's nightmares gradually shifted. Instead of seeking basement corners, he would go to the piano, playing softly until Charles joined him. They developed a ritual: hot chocolate, quiet conversation, and shared silence that grew more comfortable with each passing night. Sometimes Tommy would fall asleep at the piano, and Charles would carry him to bed, marveling at how such a small person could carry such profound music. Their first public appearance together was at a foundation fundraiser. Tommy insisted on performing, choosing a piece Clara had composed found among his basement treasures. The audience fell silent as he announced, "This is Mother's Dream by Clara Thompson." Charles stood backstage, tears streaming as Clara's music filled the hall for the first time in decades. The media noticed their growing bond. Photos circulated of them at music shops, carrying sheet music, sharing ice cream after concerts. The narrative shifted from scandal to redemption. "Eastern Air finds harmony through unlikely guardian role," declared the Times. But their real story happened in private moments, Tommy teaching Charles basic piano scales, both laughing at his clumsy attempts. They created new traditions. Sunday mornings became basement breakfast, simple meals eaten picnic-style on the floor, honoring Tommy's survival skills while creating happier associations. They would talk about Clara, each sharing pieces of her story until she felt present in the room, her love echoing in their words. Charles learned to recognize the signs of Tommy's anxiety: finger-tapping patterns, distant gaze, retreat into silence. He'd clear his schedule, understanding that healing wasn't linear. Sometimes they'd drive to Anderson Heights, sitting in the car while Tommy gathered courage to share another basement memory. Each revelation was a gift of trust. Their most significant breakthrough came when Tommy asked about Charles's childhood. "Were you lonely in the mansion?" The question pierced Charles's carefully maintained facade. For the first time, he shared his own stories of growing up under Eleanor's rigid expectations, of finding warmth in Clara's brief presence. Tommy listened, understanding loneliness from both sides of the wealth divide. As summer approached, Tommy surprised Charles by composing a simple piece for him. "It's called New Home," he explained shyly, playing the hopeful melody. Charles recognized it as a turning point. Tommy wasn't just accepting his new life, he was actively creating it. The piece became their evening ritual, a musical reminder of their unconventional family's formation. Their bond grew not just through grand gestures, but in quiet moments, Charles learning to make Tommy's favorite sandwich exactly right, Tommy leading hand-drawn music notes in Charles's briefcase, shared smiles over inside jokes about classical composers. These small acts of caring filled the spaces where fear and distrust had lived. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the penthouse balcony, Tommy said quietly, "Mum would have liked this." Charles looked at Clara's son, seeing in him both the healing of the past and the promise of the future. "Yes," he replied, "she always did love a beautiful melody." The first major attack came from the Wall Street Journal, an investigative piece questioning Charles Easton's mental state and business judgment. "Easton Empire at Risk: Heir's erratic behavior raises concerns," ran beneath a split image of the Anderson Heights demolition site and Tommy's first public piano recital. Eleanor Easton's fingerprints were invisible but unmistakable. Board members began expressing their concerns through carefully worded emails and pointed questions during meetings. The Anderson Heights delay had created a domino effect, impacting other development projects. Investors were getting nervous, and Eleanor expertly stoked their fears. "Charles is sudden. Paternal interests have clouded his business acumen," she told the board, each word calculated for maximum damage. Social Services launched an unexpected investigation, triggered by anonymous concerns about Tommy's living situation. The questions were invasive. Why had Charles really taken in Tommy? What was his relationship with Clara Thompson? Why choose guardianship over traditional adoption channels? Sarah Mitchell recognized Eleanor's influence in the specific nature of the inquiries. The whispers at Winchester Academy grew louder. Parents questioned Tommy's accelerated admission, suggesting money had bought his place. Some withdrew their children from his classes, citing discomfort with the media attention. Tommy's piano teacher found notes on her desk questioning her judgment in promoting the Basement Boys' talent. Catherine Reynolds, investigating for her article, uncovered a systematic campaign to discredit both Charles and Tommy. "Someone's pulling strings," she warned Charles, creating a narrative of instability and questionable motives. "They're trying to force a choice, your company or the boy." Eleanor's public stance was particularly damaging, concern wrapped in maternal worry. "I only want what's best for Charles," she told supporters at a charity gala. This fixation with Clara Thompson's son, it's reopening old wounds. Sometimes kindness can be misguided. Her words carried weight with longtime family allies. The pressure intensified when financial reports leaked showing the cost of Tommy's security, education, and musical training. Business blogs calculated the price of redemption, suggesting Charles was using shareholder money to assuage personal guilt. Legal teams scrambled to contain the damage, but the narrative was already spinning out of control. Tommy's past became public fodder. Reporters tracked down former neighbors from Anderson Heights, piecing together his years in the basement. Some stories painted him as a calculating survivor who'd manipulated Charles's guilt, while others questioned his mental stability after years of isolation. Each new article felt like a fresh wound. Charles's ex-wife emerged with her own allegations, claiming his obsession with Clara had destroyed their marriage. He kept her photograph, she told a gossip column. Now he has her son. Draw your own conclusions. The insinuation was clear and toxic. designed to question Charles's motives for taking in Tommy. Professional child psychologists weighed in without ever meeting Tommy, their speculations adding academic weight to the growing controversy. Sudden environmental changes can be traumatic, one expert wrote. Moving from extreme poverty to excessive wealth may create lasting psychological damage. Their theories ignored Tommy's remarkable resilience and musical gifts. Winchester Academy faced its own battles. Major donors threatened to withdraw support, concerned about the school's association with scandal. The Board of Trustees scheduled an emergency meeting to review admission policies code for discussing Tommy's future at the institution. Even the music community, initially supportive, began to fracture. Some questioned whether Tommy's performances were exploitative, suggesting Charles was using the boy's talent for public relations. Prestigious competitions quietly removed him from consideration, citing administrative concerns. But Sarah Mitchell fought back through official channels, documenting Tommy's progress and stability. Her reports highlighted his academic achievements, emotional growth, and the positive influence of music in his life. But she couldn't counter every attack, every insinuation, every carefully planted doubt. The crisis peaked when Eleanor orchestrated a board vote on Charles's leadership. The motion cited emotional decision-making and deteriorating business focus as grounds for temporary removal from operational control. The vote was scheduled for the day after Tommy's first major piano competition. Through it all, Tommy played. His music became more complex, more emotional, carrying both pain and defiance. During a particularly difficult press day, he performed Beethoven's Pathetic Sonata, each note a response to those who sought to separate him from his new home. Charles watched the opposition mount with growing clarity. Every attack confirmed his suspicions about his mother's role in Clara's fate years ago. The same tactics, the same subtle pressure, the same manipulation of public opinion. But this time, he wasn't a powerless 19-year-old. This time, he would fight. One evening, as negative headlines scrolled across his phone, Charles heard Tommy playing Clara's composition. The music rose above the chaos, pure and undeniable. In that moment, he made a decision. If protecting Tommy meant losing his empire, so be it. Some things were worth more than legacy. The discovery happened by accident. While helping Tommy organize his sheet music, Charles found a bundle of water-damaged letters at the bottom of the cardboard piano he'd refused to throw away. They were written in Clara's flowing hand, addressed to Charles Easton, dated from her final years. Each envelope was sealed, never sent, telling a story that would shatter everything. Dearest Charles, the first letter began, "I don't blame you anymore. Time has taught me that we were both prisoners of circumstances beyond our control. But there's something you need to know." The words blurred as Charles's hands trembled, Tommy watching silently from the piano bench as the past unfolded in their present. The letters revealed a devastating truth. Clara had tried to reach out multiple times over the years, not for herself, but for Tommy. Her letters spoke of mysterious return mail, blocked phone calls, and representatives of the Easton Foundation warning her to stay away. Behind each thwarted attempt, Eleanor's shadow loomed, her influence reaching far beyond the mansion's walls. More shocking were the details of Clara's forced marriage to Gregory Mitchell. Eleanor hadn't just arranged it, she'd orchestrated a complete erasure of Clara's identity. Bank accounts closed, references withdrawn, music school applications mysteriously rejected. Clara's dreams hadn't just been derailed, they'd been systematically destroyed. Tommy's discovery of his mother's letters triggered a flood of memories. He remembered Clara writing late at night, tears falling on paper, her whispered words now taking on new meaning. Someday, he'll understand. Someday, the music will find its way home. She'd known, somehow, that Tommy would eventually reach Charles. Catherine Reynolds, reviewing the letters for her article, uncovered more connections. Eleanor's charity foundation had blocked Clara's attempts to establish a music program for underprivileged children. Prompt applications were denied, potential donors discouraged. even in poverty, Clara's ability to threaten the Eastern reputation had to be contained. The most damning revelation came from Clara's final letter, written from her hospital bed. She'd discovered the truth about Eleanor's obsession with controlling the Eastern legacy. "Your mother's cruelty wasn't just about social status," Clara wrote. "She's protecting a secret that would destroy everything she's built. I understand now why she went to such lengths to silence me." Charles took the letters to Sarah Mitchell, their implications too serious to ignore. She helped connect more dots: the pattern of Eleanor's interference, the systematic isolation of Clara and Tommy, the recent attacks on Charles's credibility. It wasn't just about protecting the family name, it was about maintaining Eleanor's control over a deeper truth. Tommy's reaction to the letters surprised them both. Instead of anger, he showed relief. "Mom always said there was more to the story," he explained, fingers tracing the worn paper. "She made me memorize Mr. Easton's name, made me promise to find you if anything happened to her. She believed in you until the end." The media caught wind of the letters' existence, though not their content. Speculation ran wild. Eleanor's team moved quickly, suggesting they were forgeries, a desperate attempt by Charles to justify his irrational attachment to Tommy. But Clara's handwriting was unmistakable, her words carrying the weight of truth too personal to fake. Charles spent a night reading every letter chronologically, each page revealing more of Clara's strength and Eleanor's calculated cruelty. The final letter contained a postscript that made his blood run cold. "There's something in the mansion's music room, behind the third panel from the window. I hid it there the day I left. Find it, Charles. Understanding will follow." The revelation forced Charles to confront his own complicity in Clara's fate. His silence, his acceptance of Eleanor's control, had contributed to the devastation of 2 lives. The letters weren't just a record of the past, they were a call to action, a chance to finally stand against his mother's manipulations. Tommy found Charles at dawn, still surrounded by the letters. Without words, he sat at the piano and began to play not Clara's composition, but something new. The melody carried echoes of his mother's style, but spoke of future possibilities rather than past sorrows. It was his way of saying that revelation didn't have to mean destruction. Sarah Mitchell advised them to wait before making the letters public. "This isn't just about exposing Eleanor," she warned. "This is about protecting Tommy and honoring Clara's legacy. We need to be strategic." Charles agreed, but he made copies of every letter, securing them in multiple locations. Eleanor's power thrived in shadows, the truth would be their light. That evening, Charles and Tommy sat at the piano together, the letters carefully returned to their hiding place in the cardboard piano. "Mom always said music tells the truest stories," Tommy said softly, playing the opening notes of Clara's composition. Charles listened, hearing in the melody both a requiem for the past and a prelude to justice long delayed. Catherine Reynolds' investigation into Clara's past began to uncover layers of carefully orchestrated deception. Working with Sarah Mitchell, she traced a pattern of interference that stretched back decades. Every time Clara had tried to rebuild her life, invisible hands had torn it down. Job applications mysteriously withdrawn, apartment leases suddenly cancelled, music schools that had initially welcomed her abruptly closing their doors. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Marcus Sullivan, Eleanor's former driver. Now retired and dying of cancer, he reached out to Catherine with a story he'd carried for 25 years. On the night Clara left the mansion, he'd driven her not to Gregory Mitchell's house as ordered, but to a bus station at her desperate request. Eleanor had discovered his defiance the next day. "Mrs. Easton made me choose," Marcus told Catherine, his hospital room voice barely a whisper. "My job, my pension, my family's security, or the truth about that night. I chose wrong. I've lived with that shame ever since." He provided dated photographs, duty logs, and most crucially, his personal journal from that period. The journal revealed Eleanor's obsession with controlling every aspect of Clara's removal. She'd hired private investigators to track Clara's movements, paid off local music schools to reject her applications, and even manipulated Gregory Mitchell into abandoning Clara through carefully planted rumors about her mental stability. Tommy's memories became crucial pieces of the puzzle. Working with Dr. Foster, his psychologist, he began to recall details from his early childhood. Clara had moved them frequently, always looking over her shoulder. She'd taught piano lessons under different names, careful to maintain a low profile. Even in poverty, she'd been running from Eleanor's influence. Sarah Mitchell discovered a pattern in Clara's hospital records. Several promising experimental treatments had been suddenly withdrawn, funding mysteriously cancelled. The dates corresponded with large donations from Eastern Foundation shell companies to the hospital board members' pet projects. Eleanor's reach had extended literally to Clara's deathbed. Charles, reviewing old Foundation records, found a series of payments to a private security firm specialized in reputation management. The firm's reports detailed surveillance of Clara and Tommy, including photographs of their basement dwelling. Eleanor had known about Tommy's situation for months before Charles's discovery, choosing to let a child suffer to maintain her control. The most disturbing evidence came from Clara's former students at the community center. Catherine tracked down dozens of them, each sharing similar stories. They spoke of Clara's talent and kindness, but also of mysterious circumstances that forced the program to close. One former student, now a music teacher herself, had kept a letter from Clara that hinted at the truth. Sometimes the most powerful people fear the simplest things, like music that speaks truth to power. Tommy's diary from the basement years proved invaluable. Behind the childish handwriting lay observations that now took on new significance. He'd noted men in suits watching the building, described feeling followed on his scavenging runs, even drawn pictures of cars that would park outside for hours. Eleanor's surveillance had been constant, if distant. The investigation led Catherine to Gregory Mitchell, now living in Arizona. Initially hostile, he broke down after seeing recent photos of Tommy at the piano. Eleanor Easton destroyed 3 lives that year, he admitted. Clara's, the child's, and mine. She has files on everyone, you see. Knows every secret, every weakness. I was a coward, but Clara fought back the only way she could, through her music and her son. Charles hired private investigators to examine the Eastern Foundation's charitable giving patterns. They uncovered a network of donations designed to maintain surveillance and control over Clara's movements. Every time she'd tried to establish herself in a new city, Foundation money would flow to local organizations, followed by Clara's swift departure. The investigation also revealed Eleanor's systematic campaign to erase Clara's musical legacy. Recordings from her Juilliard performances had vanished from the school's archives. Reviews of her early concerts disappeared from newspaper databases. Even her senior recital program had been removed from the school's records. It was as if Eleanor wanted to erase not just Clara, but the very memory of her talent. Sarah Mitchell focused on Tommy's years in the basement, building a timeline that paralleled Eleanor's Foundation activities. Every time a concerned citizen had reported a child living in the building, mysterious donations would flow to local agencies and investigations would be quietly closed. The pattern was clear. Eleanor had actively prevented Tommy's discovery. As the evidence mounted, Charles struggled with his own memories of that time. He began to recall small details, conversations overheard, documents glimpsed on his mother's desk, Clara's increasing fear in the weeks before her departure. His youth and privilege had blinded him to the machinery of oppression working around him. Catherine's investigation reached a turning point when she discovered a safe deposit box in Clara's name, opened just before her death. Inside was a recording Clara playing her own compositions, her musical testimony. But more importantly, there was a letter addressed to Eleanor, never sent, containing information that made Catherine's blood run cold. The truth was larger and more terrible than anyone had imagined. Clara's silencing wasn't just about a young woman from the wrong social class, or even about protecting the Eastern name. Her music had been a threat because it carried echoes of a story Eleanor had spent a lifetime burying, a story that would shake the foundations of not just the Eastern Empire, but several of New York's most powerful families. As Catherine prepared to publish her findings, she received a hand-delivered note from Eleanor Easton herself. Inside was a single sentence: "Some melodies are better left unplayed." It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. The real story was still hiding behind the evidence, waiting for the right moment to emerge. In the midst of Catherine's investigation, life at the penthouse underwent subtle but profound changes. Tommy's nightmares began to feature new elements: men in dark suits watching from shadows, his mother hurriedly burning papers late at night, whispered conversations he hadn't understood at the time, but now carried darker meaning. Charles found himself spending more nights on the couch outside Tommy's room, ready to combat these new demons. Eleanor's attempts to connect with Tommy took on a calculated intensity. She arrived unannounced with expensive gifts: a limited edition collection of classical recordings, an antique metronome that had belonged to a famous composer. Each present was carefully chosen to demonstrate her understanding of his passion for music, but Tommy received them with a pianist's hands held deliberately still. The dynamic between Charles and Tommy deepened through their shared discovery of Clara's past. During evening practice sessions, Tommy would sometimes pause, sharing fragments of memories that now made more sense. "Mom used to check the locks 3 times every night," he'd say, fingers hovering over the keys. She said music needed to feel safe to be truly heard. But Charles's relationship with his mother shifted into dangerous territory. Their weekly foundation meetings became elaborate chess matches, each aware of the other's knowledge but maintaining a facade of normalcy. Eleanor's voice remained warm, her suggestions reasonable, but her eyes followed Tommy's every appearance with the focus of a hunter studying prey. At Winchester Academy, Tommy's position evolved in unexpected ways. As news of the investigation leaked, some parents who had previously shunned him began to see his presence differently. The basement boy. Narrative transformed into something more complex, a story of generational privilege confronting its own shadows. Tommy handled the attention with his mother's quiet dignity, letting his music speak louder than gossip. The household staff's loyalty shifted decisively toward Tommy after Eleanor's particularly cruel attempt to undermine him. She had suggested to Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeper who had become something of a surrogate grandmother to Tommy, that her position might be more secure if she shared her observations of the boy's unstable behavior instead. Mrs. Rodriguez came directly to Charles, tears of anger in her eyes. Sarah Mitchell noticed Tommy developing protective instincts toward Charles. During particularly stressful foundation meetings, Tommy would position his practice sessions near Charles's office, playing pieces that he knew brought his guardian peace. It was his way of offering support, creating a musical shield against Eleanor's psychological warfare. The most significant evolution occurred in how Tommy spoke about Clara. As Catherine's investigation revealed more about his mother's struggles, his pride in her resilience grew. During his performances, he began introducing her compositions with brief stories not of their hardships, but of her unwavering dedication to music and truth. Each recital became both tribute and testimony. Charles found himself sharing more about his own past, breaking down the careful walls of privilege he'd constructed. He told Tommy about his father's early death, how Eleanor's control had filled the void with steel and ambition. "Your mother," he admitted one evening, "was the first person who made music sound like freedom instead of obligation." Eleanor's relationship with the board of directors grew more complex as whispers of the investigation spread. Longtime allies began to create subtle distance, conscious of how quickly power could shift. Young board members, particularly those with artistic backgrounds, started paying attention to Tommy's performances, seeing something revolutionary in the way music was challenging established power. The press noticed these evolving dynamics. Articles began to appear analyzing the symbolic significance of Tommy's presence in the Eastern world. Cultural critics wrote pieces about the intersection of music, power, and redemption. Tommy's performances were reviewed not just as musical events but as moments of social transformation. Through it all, Tommy's relationship with Clara's memory deepened and matured. He spent hours with her letters, not just reading but absorbing the strength in her words. His compositions began to incorporate themes from her unfinished works, creating a musical dialogue between past and present. During one particularly moving performance, he played a duet with a recording of her playing, their melodies intertwining across time. Charles watched these relationships shift and evolve with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Each new revelation from Catherine's investigation had the potential to shatter their carefully reconstructed world. Yet he observed how Tommy seemed to grow stronger with each truth uncovered, as if finally understanding his mother's courage allowed him to fully embrace his own. The most profound evolution was invisible to outsiders. In quiet moments when the day's battles were done, Charles and Tommy had begun to create their own language of trust. It lived in small gestures, a hand on a shoulder during difficult passages, shared smiles at private jokes, the comfortable silence of family. Against Eleanor's cold power, they were building something warm and real. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of revelations and reporters, Tommy sat at the piano and played a new piece. The melody wove together themes from Clara's work with original compositions, creating something both old and new. "It's called Three Hearts," he told Charles. "For Mom, for you, for me." In that moment, Charles understood they weren't just surviving Eleanor's opposition, they were transforming it into something beautiful. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While preparing for a foundation gala, workers renovating the old Easton mansion discovered a hidden compartment behind the music room's wood paneling, exactly where Clara's final letter had indicated. Inside, wrapped in yellowed silk, lay a bundle of photographs, letters, and a small leather diary that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of the Easton legacy. The diary belonged not to Clara, but to Eleanor's sister, Catherine Easton. Its pages revealed a devastating family secret. Clara Thompson hadn't been just another household employee. She was Catherine's daughter, given up for adoption after a scandal that Eleanor had helped conceal. Clara had been unknowingly working in her own family's home, serving the aunt who had orchestrated her separation from her birth mother. Catherine Reynolds pieced together the story through careful cross-referencing. Catherine Easton, a talented pianist herself, had become pregnant after an affair with a visiting musician. Eleanor, already the family's de facto matriarch following their parents' death, had handled the problem with characteristic efficiency. The baby was placed for adoption, Catherine was sent to Europe for her health, and the Easton name remained untarnished. The photographs told their own story. A young Catherine at the piano, her resemblance to Clara striking. Hospital records hidden between diary pages. Most damning was a series of letters between Eleanor and the adoption agency, revealing her continued monitoring of Clara's life. She had orchestrated Clara's hiring at the mansion, not out of charity, but to maintain control over a threat to the family's reputation. Tommy's reaction to learning of his true heritage was complex. "Mom used to say music was in our blood," he told Charles quietly, his fingers tracing the piano keys. She felt it the first time she entered the music room, like something was calling to her. The diary revealed that Catherine had died in Paris just months before Clara's employment at the mansion, never knowing her daughter had returned home. Charles struggled with the implications. His mother hadn't just orchestrated Clara's departure, she had knowingly forced her own niece into a loveless marriage, separated a mother from her child, all to maintain the illusion of Eastern perfection. The revelation of Tommy as his cousin's son transformed their bond from choice to blood, making Eleanor's actions even more unforgivable. The hidden documents included evidence of Eleanor's broader scheme. Financial records showed payments to Gregory Mitchell stretching back years before Clara's pregnancy. He had been Eleanor's puppet, paid to marry Clara if she ever became a threat. The pregnancy had simply accelerated Eleanor's existing plan to remove Clara from Charles's life and the Eastern sphere. More discoveries followed. Clara's Juilliard acceptance letter, hidden among Eleanor's papers, revealed she had earned a full scholarship, later revoked through Eleanor's interference. Bank statements showed a trust fund in Clara's name, established by Catherine, that Eleanor had quietly absorbed into the family foundation. Even Clara's musical compositions had been suppressed, copies destroyed to maintain the fiction of her insignificance. Sarah Mitchell uncovered another layer of deception. Eleanor's recent attempts to discredit Charles's guardianship of Tommy weren't just about control, they were about preventing any DNA tests that might reveal the family connection. Several labs had received substantial donations from Eastern shell companies, coinciding with missing or corrupted test results. The most heartbreaking discovery was a letter from Clara to Catherine, written but never sent, found among her basement possessions. "I feel you in this house," she had written, "in the music room especially. Something in my heart knows I belong here, even as everything else tells me to run." She had sensed the truth but never confirmed it. Tommy's musical gift took on new meaning. Catherine had been a prodigy, her talent silenced by family expectations. Clara had inherited that gift, only to have it suppressed by Eleanor's machinations. Now Tommy, third in this line of silenced musicians, was finally playing the melodies that had been buried for generations. Catherine's investigation revealed Eleanor's ongoing efforts to maintain the secret. Regular payments to former household staff who might remember Catherine's pregnancy, donations to hospitals where records were stored. Even Clara's fatal illness had been potentially influenced, certain treatments withheld, specialists mysteriously unavailable. The truth had implications beyond the Easton family. Other powerful New York families were implicated in Eleanor's cover-up, their own secrets intertwined with the Easton saga. The web of influence and suppression stretched through boardrooms, social clubs, and charitable foundations, all designed to maintain the illusion of aristocratic perfection. Charles found himself drawn to the mansion's music room, standing where Clara had once played, where Catherine's talent had been silenced. The space held generations of suppressed music, of silenced truths. Tommy joined him there one evening, sitting at the old piano. His playing filled the room with something new, not just music, but liberation. The hidden truths emerged not as mere scandal, but as a testimony to 3 generations of artists fighting against suppression. Catherine's diary, Clara's letters, and Tommy's music formed a trilogy of resistance. Each had fought Eleanor's control in their own way, using music to preserve their essence, even as their circumstances were manipulated. As Catherine prepared to publish her findings, Tommy composed a new piece titled Catherine's Echo. The melody incorporated themes found in Catherine's own compositions, discovered among the hidden papers. When he performed it at his next recital, the music seemed to fill in the gaps of their family story, giving voice to all that had been silenced. The confrontation took place in the Easton Mansion's music room, where 3 generations of secrets had been buried. Eleanor arrived expecting her usual board meeting, only to find Charles and Tommy waiting, Catherine's diary open on the piano. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, turning the space into a theater for the final act of a decades-long tragedy. "I suppose," Eleanor said, her voice arctic, "we can dispense with pretense." She moved with practiced grace to her customary chair as if this were any other business discussion. But her eyes never left Catherine's diary, the small leather-bound volume that threatened everything she'd spent a lifetime protecting. Charles stood by the piano, where Tommy sat silently, fingers resting on the keys. "Why, Mother? She was your niece. Your own flesh and blood." The questions he'd rehearsed disappeared in the face of her composed demeanor. Eleanor's smile was a masterpiece of condescension. "You never understood the weight of legacy, Charles. Catherine's indiscretion threatened everything our family built. Clara's existence was a crack in our foundation. I simply maintained structural integrity." She spoke of destroying lives with the same tone she used to discuss property development. Tommy began to play softly Catherine's composition, found among the hidden papers. Eleanor's facade cracked slightly at the familiar melody. Stopped that she snapped, but Tommy continued, his music giving voice to decades of silenced truths. The notes filled the room with Catherine's ghost. "You watched her die," Charles said, his voice shaking. "You knew Clara was dying, just like Catherine, and you did nothing. You let your great-nephew live in a basement rather than risk your precious reputation." Each word was a weapon, aimed at the armor of Eleanor's carefully constructed world. Eleanor's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Risk? I protected this family while you played at rebellion. That girl, Catherine's mistake, she had her mother's gift for causing trouble. The basement was better than she deserved. At least there she couldn't threaten what generations built." The confrontation escalated as Charles revealed Catherine Reynolds' findings, the payments, the manipulations, the systematic destruction of Clara's opportunities. With each revelation, Eleanor's composure shifted from defensive to dangerous. "You fool," she hissed at Charles. "You have no idea what you're unraveling." Tommy's music changed, incorporating Clara's themes into Catherine's melody. The combination seemed to physically pain Eleanor. She rose, moving to stop him, but Charles stepped between them. "No more, Mother. You don't get to silence this family's music again." The next moments were chaos. Eleanor produced legal documents, board resolutions, psychiatric evaluations, custody challenges. "Choose carefully," Charles, she warned. "Cross me and you'll lose everything. The company, your position, the boy. Is your conscience worth that much?" But Charles had anticipated this. Sarah Mitchell arrived with their own documents, proof of Eleanor's interference, testimony from Marcus Sullivan, evidence of her systematic campaign against Clara. The weight of truth finally seemed to stagger Eleanor. "You never understood power," Eleanor said, her voice trembling for the first time. "Our world isn't built on truth, it's built on necessary lies. Catherine knew that. Clara learned it. What makes you think you're stronger than they were?" Tommy stopped playing, turning to face his great-aunt. "Mom wasn't weak," he said quietly, his first words of the confrontation. "She kept playing, kept teaching, kept loving. That's real strength." His words, so simple and clear, cut through Eleanor's defenses like nothing else had. The confrontation reached its climax when Charles revealed their final piece of evidence, Clara's recording from the safety deposit box. Her music filled the room, her talent undeniable, her spirit unbowed. Eleanor sank into her chair, the weight of decades of control suddenly visible in her posture. "It's over," Mother Charles said softly. "The board meets tomorrow. Catherine's article runs the next day. You can fight us, watch your legacy crumble into scandal, or you can step down quietly. Let us heal what you broke." Eleanor looked at Tommy, really looked at him, perhaps seeing Catherine and Clara in his face for the first time. "You look so much like her," she whispered, and for a moment they weren't sure which her she meant. "I did what I thought was right." "No," Charles countered, "you did what was easy. Controlling people is easier than loving them. Silencing truth is easier than facing it, but we're choosing the harder path now." The confrontation ended not with a bang, but with silence. Eleanor stood, straightened her jacket with trembling hands, and walked to the door. She paused there, looking back at the piano where Tommy sat. "You play just like she did," she said softly. Like both of them, then she was gone, leaving the music room to its ghosts and its truths. Tommy turned back to the piano, playing the piece he'd composed, 3 hearts, its notes carrying hope instead of hatred. Charles watched his mother's retreating figure through the window, knowing tomorrow would bring its own battles. But for now, in this room where so much had been lost, something was finally being found. The sun set behind the mansion, its light catching the dust motes dancing in the air. They looked like musical notes, Charles thought, finally free to float where they would. The day after the confrontation, Catherine Reynolds' article detonated across New York society like a carefully placed charge. The silenced symphony, 3 generations of buried truth, ran across the front page of the Sunday Times, accompanied by photographs of Catherine, Clara, and Tommy at their respective pianos. The story spread through social media like wildfire, each revelation more devastating than the last. Eleanor's carefully constructed world began to crumble as other voices joined the chorus. Marcus Sullivan's hospital room testimony became a viral video, the dying man's confession lending undeniable weight to the accusations. Former household staff came forward with their own stories, each account adding detail to the portrait of Eleanor's decades-long manipulation. The most damaging revelations came from unexpected quarters. Gregory Mitchell, breaking his long silence, provided Catherine with a recorded conversation in which Eleanor had orchestrated Clara's marriage. His voice shook as he described how Eleanor had used his gambling debts as leverage, forcing him to participate in destroying Clara's life. "I'll carry that shame to my grave," he said, "but at least now the truth is known." Tommy's story became a symbol of both tragedy and triumph. Photos of his basement dwelling, juxtaposed with images of him playing Clara's compositions, sparked intense debate about privilege, power, and the cost of silence. Music critics, who had dismissed him as a curiosity, now wrote passionate pieces about the legacy of suppressed talent flowing through his performances. The Eastern Foundation's board members scrambled to distance themselves as evidence of their complicity emerged. Documents showed how they had rubber-stamped Eleanor's decisions, ignored clear evidence of her manipulation, and profited from their silence. Several resigned immediately, others issued carefully worded statements expressing shock and deep concern. Clara's former students organized a memorial concert, each performing pieces she had taught them in secret. Their stories painted a portrait of a woman who refused to let her music die, teaching in borrowed spaces with borrowed instruments, always looking over her shoulder but never stopping. The concert hall was packed, the audience including many who had once shunned her. Charles faced his own revelations. Going through Eleanor's private files, he discovered just how close he had come to losing Tommy. His mother had prepared everything: falsified psychological evaluations, manipulated custody hearings, even a planned accident. That would have sent Tommy to a carefully chosen foster home. The evidence left him shaking. The most profound revelations came from Catherine's diary. Her words, hidden for so long, told a story of passion suppressed by privilege, of art sacrificed to appearance. Her description of giving up Clara, written in anguished midnight entries, brought tears to Tommy's eyes. Some music she had written is too beautiful for the world to accept. Sarah Mitchell uncovered a network of similar stories in other prominent families: talented children redirected from artistic pursuits, inconvenient relatives hidden away, passions sacrificed to propriety. Eleanor's methods, it seemed, were not unique but rather part of a larger pattern of power maintaining itself through suppression. Tommy's own revelations came through music. As he read Catherine's diary and Clara's letters, his compositions began to change. He incorporated their themes, their pain, their defiance into new works that spoke of both loss and survival. His piece 3 Generations became an overnight sensation, its melody carrying echoes of all that had been silenced. The revelations reached beyond New York. Similar stories began emerging from other cities, other powerful families. Eleanor's methods had set a template that others had followed. As each new account emerged, the scope of the suppression became clear: a symphony of silence enforced by privilege and power. Catherine's investigation revealed the full extent of Eleanor's control over Clara's medical care. Doctors came forward admitting they had withheld treatment options, directed by substantial donations from Eastern Foundation shell companies. Clara's death, it seemed, had been as carefully managed as her life. The artistic community rallied around Tommy. Famous musicians offered to perform with him, record labels proposed albums, concert halls extended invitations, but it was his performance at Clara's former community center that moved people most deeply. Playing on the same battered upright piano his mother had used, Tommy gave voice to everything that had been hidden. Charles discovered his own father's role in the story through Eleanor's private correspondence. Alexander Easton had opposed Clara's dismissal, had tried to protect Catherine's child. his sudden death shortly after had never been fully investigated. The implications left Charles reeling, adding another layer to the family's tragic history. The final revelation came from Eleanor herself. As the story broke, she retreated to the mansion, emerging only to release a statement that shocked everyone. She didn't deny the accusations or attempt to justify her actions. Instead, she revealed her own suppressed truth. She too had once been a gifted musician, forced to abandon her art for the family business. Her destruction of others' musical dreams had been a projection of her own loss. As the revelations continued to emerge, Tommy sat at his piano in the penthouse, playing into the night. His music wove together all the threads of their shared story: Catherine's passion, Clara's resilience, his own survival. Charles listened, understanding finally that truth, like music, cannot be buried forever. It finds its way to the surface, note by note, generation by generation, until its song can no longer be denied. The revelations transformed their world, but the most profound changes were internal. In giving voice to the past, they had begun to heal the present. Tommy's music carried not just the pain of what was lost, but the promise of what could still be found when truth is finally allowed to sing. The public fallout from Catherine Reynolds' article transformed New York's social landscape overnight. The Easton Foundation's annual gala, usually the highlight of the philanthropic calendar, saw unprecedented cancellations. Society matrons who had once competed for Eleanor's attention now avoided any association with the Easton name. The carefully constructed facade of old money propriety cracked, revealing the rot beneath. Winchester Academy faced its own crisis. Parents demanded an investigation into how Eleanor's influence had affected admissions and arts programming over the years. The discovery that talented scholarship students had been systematically excluded to maintain social exclusivity led to the resignation of 3 board members. Tommy's presence became a lightning rod for broader discussions about privilege and opportunity. The legal implications snowballed. The district attorney's office opened an investigation into potential criminal misconduct, focusing on Eleanor's manipulation of medical care and social services. Child Protective Services faced external audit over their handling of Tommy's case. The SEC began examining the Easton Foundation's financial records, suspicious of how charitable funds had been used to enforce silence. Charles navigated corporate fallout while protecting Tommy from the media circus. Major shareholders demanded emergency meetings, concerned about the company's future. Development projects stalled as partners distanced themselves from the scandal. The Anderson Heights project, where Tommy had been discovered, became a symbol of both corruption and redemption. Social media amplified every development. Justice for Clara trended nationwide, with musicians posting performances of her compositions. Tommy's story spawned countless think pieces about privilege, art, and redemption. Videos of his performances went viral, each viewed through the lens of his family's tragic history. The artistic community's response was particularly powerful. Famous musicians revealed their own stories of suppression and compromise. Conservatories announced scholarships in Clara's name. The New York Philharmonic commissioned a piece based on Tommy's 3 generations, bringing his family's music to their grandest stage. Eleanor's few remaining allies attempted damage control, suggesting she had acted to protect family interests in a less enlightened time. Their efforts backfired when more victims of similar suppression came forward. The pattern of powerful families silencing artistic talent in favor of suitable pursuits proved widespread and systematic. The business press focused on Charles's position. Some praised his courage in exposing the truth, others questioned his judgment in risking the company's stability. Competitors circled, sensing weakness. But Charles's transparency about his own past failures and his commitment to change began to shift the narrative from scandal to transformation. Tommy's public appearances required careful management. News crews camped outside Winchester Academy, forcing the school to hire additional security. Social media tracked his every performance, analyzing his music for references to family history. The pressure might have crushed someone less resilient, but Tommy responded with increasingly powerful compositions. The fallout reached other prominent families. Similar stories emerged: talented children redirected from artistic pursuits, inconvenient relatives hidden away, passions sacrificed to propriety. Eleanor's methods, it became clear, were not unique but rather part of a larger pattern of power maintaining itself through suppression. Sarah Mitchell coordinated with child advocacy groups to propose legislation preventing similar situations. The basement boy law, as the media dubbed it, would strengthen oversight of private foundations and increase protections for talented children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Tommy's testimony before the state legislature moved hardened politicians to tears. The cultural impact deepened as academics and critics examined the broader implications. Papers were written about the intersection of class, art, and power. Documentarians requested interviews. Publishers approached Charles and Tommy about book deals. Their story became a lens through which society examined its own values and prejudices. The financial repercussions hit hard. The Eastern Foundation's donors demanded accountability, with many redirecting their support to new initiatives focused on artistic access and education. Eleanor's carefully cultivated network of influence crumbled as investigations revealed the full scope of her manipulation of charitable funds. Winchester Academy's music department underwent radical transformation. The new board, eager to distance itself from past practices, established blind auditions for all music programs. Tommy's presence inspired a revision of admissions policies, emphasizing talent over social connections. His fellow students, initially wary, began to see him as a catalyst for necessary change. The media's attention inevitably began to fade, but the structural changes continued. Charles's corporate leadership, once questioned, earned respect as he steered the company toward greater transparency and social responsibility. The Anderson Heights project was redesigned to include a community arts center, turning a symbol of suppression into one of opportunity. Through it all, Tommy kept playing. His music evolved, incorporating the complex emotions of their public ordeal. Critics noted how his compositions balanced pain and hope, restriction and freedom. His performances became not just concerts but testimonies to the power of art to survive and transform. The most lasting fallout was personal. Other families began to examine their own histories, their own compromises. Conversations about talent versus expectation, art versus propriety emerged in unexpected places. Tommy's story challenged assumptions about success and worth that had governed society for generations. As the public storm gradually subsided, its effects remained. The Eastern name now carried different associations, not just power and privilege, but also redemption and change. Charles and Tommy's relationship, tested by intense scrutiny, emerged stronger. Their story became not just a scandal, but a catalyst for examining how society values art, truth, and the courage to pursue both. Eleanor Easton's decline began not with a bang, but with a silence. After the public revelations, she retreated to the mansion's upper floors, emerging only for brief appearances that sparked whispered conversations among the remaining staff. The woman who had once ruled New York society with an iron will now wandered empty rooms, pausing longest in the music room where 3 generations of family talent had been suppressed. Her physical decline matched her social fall. The carefully maintained facade began to slip: missed hair appointments, wrinkled clothing, hours spent staring at old photographs. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had stayed despite everything, reported finding Eleanor at the piano late at night, her fingers hovering over the keys but never pressing them, as if afraid of what sounds might emerge. The first medical episode occurred during a forced board appearance. Mid-speech, defending her actions, Eleanor faltered. Her words slurred, her usually straight posture crumpled. The video went viral, the mighty Eleanor Easton, finally bowing under the weight of her own secrets. The diagnosis was swift stress-induced stroke, complicated by years of suppressed emotion. Hospital visits became frequent, though Eleanor fought against them with her remaining strength. Each time, she demanded to be placed in rooms without pianos in the rehabilitation wing. The doctors noted her extreme reaction to music therapy sessions, elevated heart rate, anxiety attacks, occasional tears. The woman who had silenced so much music was now being tormented by its return. Even in decline, Eleanor's manipulation continued. She began writing letters to board members, to old allies, to society figures who had abandoned her. Each contained hints of secrets still unrevealed, threats wrapped in elegant penmanship. Charles intercepted most of them, recognizing them as his mother's last attempts to maintain control. Tommy's success seemed to affect her most deeply. Each news article about his performances, each glowing review, drew a visible reaction. Staff reported hearing her argue with ghosts Catherine and Clara, her own parents, defending choices made decades ago. The mansion's halls, once filled with her commanding presence, now echoed with the mumbled justifications of a failing mind. The turning point came when Tommy performed at Carnegie Hall. Eleanor watched the live stream in her study, against her doctor's advice. As her great-nephew played Clara's compositions on that prestigious stage, something in Eleanor finally broke. Mrs. Rodriguez found her at her desk, tears streaming down her face, surrounded by old photographs and programs from Catherine's youth. Charles visited regularly, watching his mother's transformation with complicated emotions. The woman who had terrorized his youth, who had destroyed Clara's life and nearly ruined Tommy's, now seemed smaller, almost fragile. Yet even in decline, she maintained her core belief I protected our world, she would insist, from the chaos of unchecked passion. Her lucid moments became rare but significant. During one such interval, she asked to see Catherine's diary. Reading her sister's words, Eleanor's hands trembled. "We were all trapped," she whispered, "by expectations I was too afraid to challenge." It was the closest she came to admitting regret. The final phase of Eleanor's decline coincided with the anniversary of Clara's death. She developed a fever that left her delirious, speaking to people long gone. The hospital staff reported her repeatedly asking forgiveness from Catherine, from Clara, from a young Charles. Music from the therapy room down the hall would send her into agitated states. Through it all, Eleanor worked on something in secret, a final document that her private nurse said consumed her clearer moments. She wrote carefully, methodically, stopping often to reference old papers and photographs. Whatever truth she was preparing to reveal, it seemed to both exhaust and liberate her. As winter approached, Eleanor's decline accelerated. The woman who had once controlled vast financial networks now struggled to sign her own name. Yet her mind seemed clearer, as if approaching death had stripped away layers of pretense. She asked Charles to bring Tommy to the mansion one last time. The visit was brief but profound. Tommy played for his great-aunt, choosing not Clara's compositions but a new piece, Forgiveness, in E minor. Eleanor listened silently, tears rolling down her cheeks. When the music ended, she simply said, "I hear Catherine in you. And Clara, I was wrong to fear that." These moments of clarity were interrupted by longer periods of confusion and decline. Eleanor's last coherent act was to finalize her document, signing it with hands that shook but a mind that seemed, finally, at peace. She sealed it in an envelope addressed to Charles and Tommy, with instructions that it be opened only after her death. The mighty Eleanor Easton, who had once silenced generations of musicians, was herself being silenced by time and truth. But in her decline, something else was rising, the very music she had fought so long to suppress. As Eleanor declined, the full extent of past pain began to surface like bodies rising from deep water. Catherine Reynolds continued her investigation, uncovering layers of trauma that had rippled through the years. But each revelation brought new understanding of how deeply Eleanor's actions had wounded not just Clara, but an entire community. Clara's final days emerged in stark detail through hospital records and staff testimonies. Her last weeks had been spent teaching music from her hospital bed, determined to pass on her gift even as treatments were mysteriously delayed or denied. Nurses remembered her playing piano in the hospital's chapel at night, her fingers growing weaker but her spirit unbroken, composing until the end. Tommy's memories of those days surfaced in fragments during his therapy sessions with Dr. Foster. He recalled his mother's whispered instructions about survival, her insistence that he memorize Charles's name, her final request, "Keep playing, my love. The music will lead you home." The sessions often ended with Tommy at the piano, his emotions finding voice through the keys. The basement years revealed their full horror through Tommy's recovered journal entries. Pages described winters without heat, summers of suffocating darkness, constant hunger paired with constant fear. Yet between these accounts of survival were musical notations. Clara's lessons continued in his mind, his cardboard keyboard keeping her teaching alive. Charles confronted his own painful memories. He found his teenage diaries, full of confused entries about Clara's sudden departure. Reading them now, his younger self's helplessness was clear. "Mum says Clara had to leave, but something feels wrong," one entry read. "The music room is so quiet now. Everything feels wrong." His failure to act haunted him anew. The community center where Clara had taught yielded more painful histories. Former students shared stories of her declining health, how she would teach through fever and fatigue, always refusing payment from those who couldn't afford it. One student remembered Clara's words, "Music isn't a privilege for the wealthy. It's food for the soul, and everyone deserves to eat." Gregory Mitchell's full confession revealed the calculated cruelty of Eleanor's arrangements. He had been forced to publicly humiliate Clara, to question her stability, to create a narrative that would justify her isolation. His own suicide attempt afterward had been buried in medical records, another secret in Eleanor's collection. Sarah Mitchell discovered Clara's attempts to protect Tommy's future. She had created a small trust fund from her teaching earnings, but Eleanor's interference had tied it up in legal complications. Even dying, Clara had fought for her son's chances, trying to leave him something beyond music and memories. The basement itself, when properly examined, told its own story of pain and perseverance. Tommy had marked his growth on a wall, not with heights but with musical achievements. "Learn Mom's Nocturne 1 Mark Reed. Mastered Bach's Prelude," said another. Each achievement was a survival strategy, a way to keep Clara's legacy alive. Catherine's interviews with former Eastern staff revealed the household's collective guilt. Many had witnessed Clara's mistreatment but remained silent, their jobs and references held hostage by Eleanor's influence. Their delayed remorse added another layer to the tragedy, the complicity of those who watch suffering and do nothing. Clara's medical records painted a devastating picture of systematic neglect. Treatments were available but made inaccessible. Specialists were consulted but their recommendations ignored. Eleanor's influence had extended into every aspect of Clara's care, ensuring that help was always just out of reach. Tommy's school records from before the basement years showed a bright, talented child whose life had been deliberately derailed. Teachers' notes praised his musical gift, recommended special programs, all opportunities lost when Clara's illness forced them into hiding. The contrast with his current success made the lost years more painful. Charles discovered love letters between his younger self and Clara, hidden in the mansion's library books. Their innocent plans and dreams highlighted how completely Eleanor had destroyed not just their relationship, but Clara's chance at any happiness. The letters ended abruptly, like a piece of music cut off mid-phrase. Most painful were Clara's final compositions, found among Tommy's basement possessions. The music grew more complex as her health declined, as if she were trying to fit a lifetime of creativity into her remaining days. The last piece, unfinished, bore the title "Tommy's Future, Her Final Gift to Her Son." Each surfaced pain connected to others, revealing the intricate web of suffering Eleanor had woven. The tragedy wasn't just in the big moments: Clara's forced marriage, Tommy's basement years, Charles's silenced love, but in the thousand small cruelties that had shaped their lives. Through it all, Tommy kept playing, his music now carrying the weight of these revealed truths. Each performance became both tribute and testimony, his fingers speaking the pain that words couldn't express. The audience might hear beautiful music, but those who knew the story heard something more, the sound of survival, of love persisting despite everything meant to silence it. The crisis peaked during Tommy's Carnegie Hall debut. As he stepped onto the stage, protesters from both sides gathered outside, some supporting the Eastern family's traditional values, others demanding justice for Clara. The performance hall became a battlefield of competing narratives, with Tommy's music caught in the crossfire. Inside, Charles watched his mother's empty seat, knowing she was declining rapidly in the mansion. The press had stationed photographers at both locations, eager to capture either Eleanor's deterioration or Tommy's potential breakdown. The pressure was immense, with critics ready to interpret every note through the lens of family tragedy. Tommy began with Clara's unfinished composition, Tommy's future now completed with his own ending. 3 measures in, his fingers faltered, the first mistake he'd made in public since leaving the basement. The audience held its breath, cameras clicked, and for a moment it seemed the weight of everything might finally crush him. The corporate fallout reached critical mass simultaneously. Major shareholders initiated a vote to remove Charles from leadership, citing the company's plummeting stock value. Development projects stalled across the city as partners withdrew, fearing association with the scandal. The empire Eleanor had built was crumbling, threatening to bury both Charles and Tommy in its collapse. Winchester Academy faced its own implosion. Anonymous notes appeared in Tommy's locker, blaming him for the school's damaged reputation. Former friends distanced themselves, their parents afraid of being drawn into the controversy. Even some faculty members suggested quietly that his continued presence was untenable. The media circus intensified as Eleanor's condition worsened. Reporters broadcast live from outside the mansion, speculating about her mental state and publishing leaked medical records. Someone released security footage of her wandering the music room at night, talking to ghosts, the mighty Eleanor Easton reduced to a figure of public pity. Social services, under pressure from multiple investigations, reopened Tommy's case. Questions arose about Charles's fitness as a guardian, given the family's history and current instability. The possibility of removing Tommy from the only stable home he'd known since Clara's death loomed like a shadow over their already fractured world. Charles's personal life disintegrated further when his ex-wife gave a televised interview, painting him as obsessed with Clara's memory and emotionally unfit to care for Tommy. Former business associates emerged with stories of his erratic behavior following Clara's departure years ago. His judgment, past and present, was dissected daily in the press. The Foundation's charitable work, one of Charles's few proud achievements, came under scrutiny. Investigations revealed that while Eleanor had used it for control, Charles's recent management had been equally questionable emotion rather than strategy driving major decisions. The possibility of criminal charges emerged. Tommy's music began to show the strain. His compositions turned darker, more chaotic, reflecting the turmoil surrounding him. During practice sessions, he would stop abruptly, overwhelmed by memories of the basement's safety compared to his current exposure. The cardboard piano reappeared in his room, a regression that worried his therapist. At Carnegie Hall, the moment of crisis stretched. Tommy's hands hovered above the keys, the silence becoming unbearable. In the audience, Charles stood, ready to go to him, to end this public crucifixion. But before he could move, Tommy began to play again, not Clara's piece, but something new, something raw and real. The composition was chaos itself, every missed note and hesitation incorporated into a story of breakdown and resilience. The audience sat stunned as Tommy transformed his pain into art, creating beauty from the very moment of his apparent failure. It was Clara's gift, surviving in her son the ability to make music from tragedy. Backstage afterward, Tommy collapsed. The pressure of performance, the weight of family legacy, the constant public scrutiny finally broke through his careful composure. Charles held him as he sobbed, photographers catching the moment through windows. Another private pain made public spectacle. That night marked their lowest point. Eleanor lay dying in the mansion, her secrets still untold. The company faced dissolution, Charles's leadership in shambles. Tommy's future hung in the balance, his gift both blessing and curse. They had lost everything Eleanor had valued: position, power, privacy, and gained only the freedom to acknowledge their pain. In the penthouse that night, Tommy returned to his cardboard piano, seeking comfort in the familiar. Charles watched, understanding finally that they had reached the bottom of their fall. Like Clara in her basement years, like Catherine before her, they had been stripped of everything except the music itself. But in that moment of complete defeat, something else emerged: a strange peace, a recognition that they had nothing left to lose, no appearances left to maintain. Rock bottom, it turned out, was also solid ground. From here they could only rise, changed but perhaps stronger for the breaking. Eleanor Easton died on a Sunday morning as bells from nearby churches filled the air with sound. Her final hours were spent in the mansion's music room, where Mrs. Rodriguez found her slumped over Catherine's diary, the sealed letter clutched in her hand. The media gathered outside barely noticed the quiet ambulance that took her away. But Charles and Tommy received the news during breakfast, their morning ritual of shared silence interrupted by the call they'd been expecting. The letter arrived by courier an hour later, Eleanor's precise handwriting on the envelope, a final assertion of control to be opened only upon my death, Eleanor Easton. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten confession that would reshape their understanding of the past 3 generations. Eleanor's words, freed from pride and pretense, revealed a truth more complex than anyone had imagined. The story began not with Clara or even Catherine, but with Eleanor herself. "I was 13, she wrote, when my father caught me playing jazz in a downtown club. Eleanor had been a prodigy, sneaking out to perform under a false name. Her punishment was absolute: the family piano sold, her hands bound at night to prevent practice, her spirit systematically broken, until she became the perfect society daughter." The USB drive contained recordings Eleanor playing at 12, her talent raw and brilliant. "I transferred these from old records," she explained, "the only evidence that Eleanor Matthews, jazz pianist, ever existed." The music was extraordinary, showing a gift equal to Catherine's, to Clara's, to Tommy's. Her treatment of Catherine emerged as an attempt to save her sister from similar pain. "I thought I was protecting her," Eleanor confessed. "I didn't understand that I had become my father. That fear can wear the mask of love." The pregnancy had been an excuse, Catherine's talent the real threat to the family's carefully maintained facade. Clara's employment at the mansion was revealed as Eleanor's twisted attempt at redemption. She had tracked Catherine's daughter through the years, arranging the chance hiring. "I thought I could control the music," she wrote, "keep it contained within acceptable bounds. I didn't understand that music, like truth, cannot be contained." The letter contained evidence of Eleanor's other attempts at atonement. Anonymous donations to music programs, scholarships established under different names, small acts of rebellion against her own rigid rules. But each attempt had been poisoned by her need for control, her fear of chaos, her inability to break free from patterns set in her childhood. Tommy's existence had been her breaking point. "He plays like I did," she wrote, "with that same wild joy I was taught to fear. Watching him at the piano, I see myself before they broke me, Catherine before I silenced her, Clara before I destroyed her. I couldn't bear it. Yet I couldn't look away." The final pages contained practical matters, changes to her will, instructions for the foundation, documents transferring control of key assets to Charles. But it was her last paragraph that brought tears to Tommy's eyes. "The music lives, despite everything I did to silence it. Perhaps that's my real legacy, proof that art survives even the cruelest attempts to contain it. Included were legal documents revealing one final truth: Clara's treatments hadn't been denied by Eleanor's interference, they had been funded by her through shell companies and false names. Her control had extended even to this, unable to simply help without maintaining power over the situation. The letter ended with a request that surprised them both. Eleanor asked that her body be cremated and the ashes scattered from the Carnegie Hall roof, a final tribute to the jazz pianist she might have been. "Let my last act be to return to the music I denied," she wrote. "Perhaps then the ghosts will finally let me rest." Charles and Tommy sat in silence after reading, the weight of generations shifting around them. The morning sun filled the penthouse with light, catching dust motes that danced like notes in the air. Finally, Tommy moved to the piano and began to play not a composed piece, but a jazz improvisation that would have made the young Eleanor Matthews proud. Mrs. Rodriguez, clearing away their breakfast, paused to listen. "Miss Eleanor played like that," once she said quietly. "Very late at night when she thought everyone was sleeping. Wild and free, like a bird escaping its cage." She left them with that image, Eleanor the musician, not Eleanor the tyrant, living on in Tommy's fingers. The letter changed everything and nothing. The past remained unchangeable, the pain still real. But understanding bloomed like music in the morning light, offering if not forgiveness, then at least comprehension. 3 generations of silenced musicians spoke through Tommy's improvisation, their melodies finally free to soar. The media narrative shifted dramatically following the release of Eleanor's letter. Catherine Reynolds' follow-up article, "The Silenced Prodigy Eleanor Easton's Hidden Legacy," transformed public perception overnight. The story of 3 generations of suppressed musicians, beginning with Eleanor herself, resonated deeply with audiences worldwide. Tommy's next performance at Carnegie Hall took on new significance. He opened with Eleanor's jazz pieces, reconstructed from the recovered recordings, before transitioning into Catherine's classical compositions and Clara's modern pieces. The program, titled "Generations Told Their Family Story Through Music," ending with his own compositions that synthesized all 3 styles. The business world's response was equally dramatic. Charles's decision to restructure the Easton Foundation into a major arts funding organization was met with widespread approval. The Anderson Heights project was reimagined as a community arts center, with practice rooms and performance spaces available to talented students regardless of their financial status. Winchester Academy underwent its own transformation. The school established the Easton Thompson Music Scholarship, specifically targeting gifted students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Tommy, once ostracized, became a symbol of the school's commitment to nurturing talent over maintaining social barriers. His former critics among the parents and board members quietly retreated. Social media exploded with support as Eleanor's jazz recordings went viral. Music historians analyzed her teenage performances, noting her innovative style and remarkable talent. The recordings provided context for her later actions, the depth of her own trauma explaining, if not excusing, her treatment of Catherine, Clara, and Tommy. The legal challenges to Charles's guardianship of Tommy evaporated as public opinion shifted. Social services closed their investigation, noting the positive impact of their relationship on both child and guardian. The board members who had opposed Charles's leadership quietly resigned, replaced by individuals committed to the company's new direction. Tommy's compositions gained recognition beyond their connection to scandal. Music critics praised his ability to blend classical training with jazz influences, noting how he incorporated elements from all 3 generations of his musical heritage. But his piece Eleanor's Liberation, based on her recovered jazz recordings, earned particular acclaim. The Easton Mansion was converted into a music school, its rooms once again filled with the sounds Eleanor had fought so long to silence. The music room where she had spent her final days became a performance space, hosting regular concerts featuring students from diverse backgrounds. The ghost of young Eleanor Matthews seemed to approve. Charles found unexpected allies in the business community. Other wealthy families, inspired by the Eastern story, began examining their own histories of artistic suppression. New partnerships formed around arts education initiatives, turning the corporate world's resources toward nurturing rather than stifling creative talent. The foundation's new focus attracted significant support. Donations poured in from individuals touched by the story of 3 generations of silenced musicians. The Clara Thompson Memorial Fund, supporting young artists from disadvantaged backgrounds, quickly became one of the city's largest arts education initiatives. Professional musicians embraced Tommy as one of their own, not for his family name but for his genuine talent. Collaborations with renowned artists followed, each performance highlighting the universal language of music. His youth and background became secondary to his gift for connecting with audiences through pure artistic expression. The press, which had once hounded them mercilessly, began telling a different story. Features focused on the positive changes emerging from the Eastern Tragedy Scholarship programs, community initiatives, artistic opportunities for underprivileged children. The narrative shifted from scandal to redemption. Winchester Academy's music program flourished under its new inclusive policies. Tommy's presence attracted talented students who might never have considered applying before. The school's concerts became celebrated events showcasing diverse voices and styles that would have shocked the old guard. Charles's corporate leadership was reframed as visionary rather than erratic. His integration of arts funding into the company's core mission was studied as a model of modern philanthropic business practices. The financial markets, initially skeptical, responded positively to the stability and purpose of the reorganized Eastern enterprises. Through it all, Tommy continued to grow as an artist. His music evolved beyond the pain of his family's past, incorporating joy, hope, and possibility. Each performance seemed to heal something in his audience, offering proof that art could triumph over trauma, that beauty could emerge from even the darkest places. As public redemption solidified, Tommy and Charles found their relationship deepening beyond guardian and ward. Their shared understanding of music's power to heal, to connect, to transform, created a bond that transcended legal definitions of family. They became partners in a mission to ensure no other talented child would face the silence that had haunted 3 generations of their family. The process of emotional healing began in small moments, quiet victories that marked their progress away from trauma. Tommy started sleeping through the night, his dreams no longer haunted by the basement's shadows. The cardboard piano, once his security blanket, was gently relocated to a display case in his room, honored but no longer needed. Charles found healing through action, transforming the pain of his past inaction into purpose. Each scholarship awarded, each new opportunity created for young musicians, helped ease the weight of his silence during Clara's ordeal. He kept a photo of her on his desk now, no longer hiding his memories but drawing strength from them. The mansion's music room became a place of healing for both of them. Regular visits to practice and perform exorcised old ghosts, replacing memories of suppression with new moments of creative freedom. Tommy composed a piece called Eleanor's Piece, incorporating elements of her jazz style with his own modern interpretations, finding reconciliation through music. Dr. Foster noted significant progress in Tommy's therapy sessions. His music began incorporating lighter themes, joy weaving through the complexity of his compositions. When he spoke of Clara now, it was with celebration of her strength rather than just mourning of her loss. The basement years became part of his story rather than its defining chapter. The healing extended to their household. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had carried her own guilt about Clara's treatment, found peace in nurturing Tommy's talent. The staff, once bound by Eleanor's rules, relaxed into a more natural family dynamic. Music filled the penthouse at all hours now, uninhibited and free. Tommy's relationships at Winchester Academy deepened as he allowed himself to form real friendships. His talent remained extraordinary, but he no longer used it as a wall between himself and others. He started teaching younger students, passing on Clara's methods with his own additions, healing himself by helping others discover their musical voices. Charles's healing manifested in his leadership style. The rigid control that had characterized the Eastern Empire gave way to more collaborative approaches. He learned to listen not just to music but to people, to trust rather than direct, to support rather than manage. His board meetings now often ended with informal concerts by scholarship recipients. The anniversary of Clara's death became a day of celebration rather than mourning. They established an annual concert series featuring young musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds, ensuring her legacy lived on through opportunities created in her name. Tommy always opened these concerts with one of her compositions, played not with sadness but with gratitude. Physical changes reflected their emotional healing. Tommy redecorated his room, moving beyond the sparse survival aesthetics he'd maintained since leaving the basement. Charles softened the penthouse's formal atmosphere, making space for art and expression. The Steinway grand piano moved to the center of their living space, no longer just an instrument but the heart of their home. Their relationship evolved as healing progressed. The initial guardian-ward dynamic matured into something more organic: mentor and protege, father and son, fellow artists. They could discuss Clara now without pain overwhelming the love in their memories. Even Eleanor's memory found a place in their healing, her own tragic story adding depth to their understanding. Tommy's compositions reflected this emotional growth. His piece Three Hearts Beating wove together themes representing Eleanor, Clara, and Catherine, finding harmony in their contrasting styles. The music spoke of reconciliation, of understanding gained through suffering, of love surviving despite everything meant to silence it. The healing touched others drawn into their story. Former students of Clara's came forward to share how she had changed their lives, each story adding to Tommy's understanding of his mother's legacy. Charles reconnected with old friends who had distanced themselves during Eleanor's reign, rebuilding relationships long thought lost. They established new traditions that honored the past while celebrating the present. Sunday brunches featured impromptu concerts where Tommy experimented with new compositions. Holiday gatherings included performances by scholarship students. Music became not just art but communion, healing through shared creativity. Dr. Foster observed how Tommy's relationship with his own talent had healed. The desperate need to prove himself worthy of Clara's legacy transformed into confident exploration of his own artistic voice. He played now not from obligation but from joy, his gift freely given rather than offered as justification for survival. The most profound healing came in quiet moments, Charles listening to Tommy practice, their shared smiles at private jokes, comfortable silences that no longer needed filling. The wounds of the past didn't disappear, but they scarred over, becoming parts of a larger story of survival and triumph. As spring bloomed in the city, Tommy composed a new piece titled Healing in B Major. Its complex harmonies spoke of pain transformed but not forgotten, of growth emerging from loss, of music's power to heal even the deepest wounds. When he played it for Charles, both understood that while their healing wasn't complete, they were finally truly home. The Clara Thompson Center for Musical Arts opened on what would have been Clara's 40th birthday. The converted Anderson Heights building gleamed in the morning sun, its restored facade maintaining the historical character while housing state-of-the-art facilities within. The basement where Tommy had survived was transformed into a recording studio, turning a place of darkness into one of creation. Tommy stood at the entrance, his fingers unconsciously tapping rhythms on his leg as the crowd gathered. The city's musical elite mingled with Clara's former students, social boundaries dissolved by their shared love of music. Children from the neighborhood pressed against the barriers, wide-eyed at the sight of the building that would soon become their artistic home. Charles watched his ward know, his son in all but name prepare for the most important performance of his young life. Tonight's piece, Clara's Symphony, was Tommy's masterwork, a 40-minute composition incorporating themes from all three generations of their musical heritage. Each movement told a story: Eleanor's suppressed jazz, Catherine's classical dreams, Clara's modern innovations, all woven together through Tommy's unique vision. The performance space, once the building's main lobby, had been designed with perfect acoustics. 3 pianos dominated the stage, a vintage jazz piano representing Eleanor, a classical grand for Catherine, and Clara's restored upright from the community center. Tommy would move between them during the performance, each instrument giving voice to a different aspect of their family story. Before the doors opened, Tommy took a private moment in the converted basement. The recording studio's walls held fragments of his old drawings, preserved behind glass as a reminder of resilience. He placed his hand against them, connecting past to present, before climbing the stairs to take his place on the stage he had once only dreamed of while hiding in these shadows. Mrs. Rodriguez helped him adjust his bow tie, tears in her eyes as she remembered the frightened boy from the basement. The first rows were filled with Clara's former students, many now teachers themselves, who had helped fund the center's scholarship program. Sarah Mitchell sat among them, her case files replaced by concert programs, pride evident in her smile. As the lights dimmed, Tommy's fingers found the keys of Eleanor's jazz piano. The first notes of Clara's symphony filled the space, tentative at first, like a child learning to walk, then growing in confidence. The music spoke of darkness and light, of survival and triumph, of 3 generations of silenced artists finally finding their voice through this boy who refused to stop playing. The basement that had once echoed with loneliness now resonated with hope. Each note carried the promise Clara had whispered to her son, in those final days the music will lead you home. And here, in this transformed space where his journey had begun, Tommy Parker played his family's music into the future, his mother's dream realized in ways she could never have imagined. The reception following Clara's symphony transformed into an impromptu celebration of healing. In the center's grand atrium, where Tommy had once scavenged for food, tables overflowed with refreshments while musicians young and old shared stories and dreams. Charles watched as his son moved through the crowd, no longer the scared basement boy but a confident young artist embracing his legacy. A surprise arrival shifted the evening's energy. Gregory Mitchell, making his first public appearance since the scandal broke. He approached Tommy with trembling hands, offering a small package wrapped in faded sheet music. Inside was Clara's original composition notebook, salvaged from their brief marriage. "She would want you to have this," he said simply before disappearing into the night. The Eastern Foundation board members, many newly appointed, presented Charles and Tommy with a resolution. The foundation would permanently fund the center's operations, ensuring that no talented child would be denied musical education due to financial constraints. Clara's vision of accessible music education would become her lasting legacy. Sarah Mitchell announced the expansion of the Basement to Broadway program, inspired by Tommy's journey. The initiative would identify and support gifted children from disadvantaged backgrounds, providing not just musical training but comprehensive family support services. The first year's cohort, seated together in their new uniforms, beamed with possibility. Mrs. Rodriguez, now the center's house manager, orchestrated the evening with graceful efficiency. Her grandson, inspired by Tommy's story, had begun piano lessons in the very studio that was once a basement refuge. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Music flowing through generations, healing old wounds while creating new connections. Tommy's fellow students from Winchester Academy performed a surprise tribute, a collective arrangement of Clara's compositions interwoven with Eleanor's recovered jazz pieces. The music spoke of reconciliation, of understanding gained through suffering, of art's power to bridge even the deepest divides. Charles found himself sharing quiet moments with Tommy throughout the evening, their bond deepened by all they'd survived together. They needed no words to communicate their shared joy, their mutual understanding of how far they'd come from those first tense days of discovery and distrust. The evening ended with an unplanned moment of perfect symmetry. Tommy invited all the musicians present, professionals, students, teachers, and beginners, to join in an improvised piece. The music that filled the atrium was chaotic but beautiful, like their journey had been. Clara's spirit seemed to float through the notes, her dream of inclusive musical education finally realized. As the last guests departed, Charles and Tommy stood in the center's doorway, watching the city lights flicker like musical notes against the sky. The basement boy and the billionaire, transformed by love and music into something closer than blood, a family bound by choice, strengthened by struggle, united by their commitment to keeping Clara's music alive in all its forms. The center would open its doors to its first full class of students tomorrow, but tonight belonged to this moment of quiet triumph. Father and son, guardian and ward, two hearts beating in harmony with the ghost of Clara's love, finally and truly home. 5 years after the opening of Clara Thompson Center, Tommy Parker Easton sat at the Steinway in Carnegie Hall, preparing for his most personal performance yet. The adoption papers had been finalized that morning, making official what their hearts had known for years. In the front row, Charles beamed with pride, while the seats around him were filled with students from the center, each representing a story of transformation. The program was simple, one piece entitled Family in 4 movements. As Tommy's fingers touched the keys, the first movement began with Eleanor's jazz rhythms, no longer suppressed but celebrated, flowing into Catherine's classical themes. The third movement carried Clara's modern innovations, before everything merged in a final movement that was purely Tommy's voice, strong, confident, free. In the audience, Mrs. Rodriguez wiped tears as she remembered the frightened boy from the basement. Next to her sat Sarah Mitchell, who had traded her social worker's clipboard for a position as the center's family services director. Gregory Mitchell had sent flowers with a simple note: Clara would be proud even Eleanor's presence could be felt in the jazz undertones of Tommy's composition. The music filled Carnegie Hall with something beyond mere sound. It carried the weight of generational healing, of pain transformed into beauty, of silence turned to symphony. Tommy played not just with his hands, but with his whole history, every note a testament to survival and triumph. As the final movement reached its crescendo, time seemed to blur. In the sweeping phrases, one could hear the basement's darkness giving way to light, fear transformed into courage, loneliness blossoming into family. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for the performance, but for the journey it represented. Backstage afterward, Charles hugged his son, no longer needing words to express their bond. Tommy's next project would be teaching at the center, passing on Clara's legacy to a new generation. The basement studio where he had once hidden now produced recordings of young artists following their dreams, each one carrying a piece of Clara's story forward. That night, in the penthouse they now truly shared as father and son, Tommy played one last piece, Clara's Lullaby, the first song she had taught him. Charles listened, understanding that their story hadn't ended but rather transformed, like a musical theme reimagined in endless variations. Outside, the city lights twinkled like musical notes against the dark sky. In a practice room at the Clara Thompson Center, a young girl from the neighborhood was discovering her own musical voice. In the basement studio, a boy who reminded everyone of Tommy was recording his first composition. And somewhere, perhaps, Clara was smiling, knowing that her music had finally found its way home. Tommy's fingers stilled on the keys as the lullaby ended. The silence that followed wasn't empty but full of love, of memory, of possibility. Father and son sat together in the gentle quiet, their hearts beating in harmony with all that had been and all that was yet to come. The music played on. The story of Tommy, Clara, and Charles touches deep emotional chords by exploring universal themes of love, sacrifice, and redemption. It reminds us that true strength isn't found in power or control, but in the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of art. Through Clara's unwavering love and sacrifice, Tommy's determination to keep music alive even in darkness, and Charles's journey from guilt to redemption, we see how the deepest wounds can become wellsprings of healing. The narrative emphasizes that family isn't just about blood, but about the choices we make and the love we choose to give. It shows how art, particularly music, can serve as a bridge across generations, healing old wounds and creating new connections. Even in our darkest moments, like Tommy in the basement or Eleanor in her final days, the human spirit's capacity for transformation remains undefeated. The story ultimately delivers a powerful message: no force is strong enough to silence the music of the human heart when it chooses to sing.